So if you share your...
So I've put together a presentation. So I'm just going to share the screen. Hopefully that works. Yeah. So what I thought I would do is just to talk through some of the themes within the exhibition and to tell you a little bit about the work of Glyn Philpot. How long would you like me to talk for?
Half an hour.
Half an hour, perfect. Okay, so very briefly then. So Glyn Philpot was a British artist who was born in 1884 in South London, and he was working throughout the 1910s, 1920s and 1930s up until his death in 1937. And one of the starting points for the exhibition is a work that we have in the collection, and I can show you that very quickly, which is a portrait of Henry, which was bequeathed to us in 2003 by Glyn Philpot's niece, Rosemary Newgas, who was a lady that I knew in the early 2000s, because I wrote my master's when I was at the Courtauld, when I was a student at the Courtauld. I wrote it on Glyn Philpot's work in the 1930s, so I got to know this work then. And so in a way, that's been the starting point for this exhibition, our collection of modern British art. And
sorry, I think I paused just quickly.
Yeah.
Just gonna... Yeah.
And so the exhibition takes its starting point. Well, there hasn't been an exhibition of Philpot's work in almost 40 years. The last major exhibition, and so this is the first show to bring together a lot of his work from across the different periods of his career, from both public museums and private collections. And so it includes work from places like the Tate, the National Portrait Gallery, the V&A, Brighton Museums and Art Gallery, the Victoria Art Gallery in Bath, the Ashmolean Museum, the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, and a number of others. And so what I'll do is I'll just talk you through the selection of images. And this is an early work, which is the self-portrait of Philpot. It's the only self-portrait that he did, as far as we know. We're borrowing this from the National Portrait Gallery, and it gives you a sense of him as a young and ambitious artist. It was really in 1908, around this time, that he started to become a successful portrait painter. And in fact, one of his paintings, a work called Manuelito, was bought by the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, which showed that he was already being collected by international collections. He, as a student, he had quite poor health as a teenager, and actually was taken out of school to be home educated. But he got a scholarship to go to Lambeth School of Art, and he won all kinds of student awards whilst he was there, and was kind of very successful, particularly in terms of his drawing. Excuse me. And he subsequently, in 1905, went to Paris, where he studied at the Académie Julian. And at the Académie Julian, it was a very kind of traditional style of French Academy of Art, where you would start with drawing sculptures, copying prints, drawing classical sculptures, and then moving on to draw the life model. And so he had this, so drawing, life drawing was absolutely central to how he worked throughout his career, and also some of the preparatory drawings for his paintings, which we'll have in cases. This is one of the earliest works, which shows how in the middle pre-Raphaelites and people like Rossetti, but also book illustrations of Charles Ricketts and Charles Shannon, who were kind of artists at the end of the 19th century into the early 20th century. And of course, William Morris and those other arts and crafts. And so this is the kind of world that he came out of. But he was looking a lot at the paintings of Manet and also Titian and the kind of Italian Renaissance. This is a work which we're borrowing from the Tate, one of the kind of first portraits in the exhibition from 1913. And in 1913, Philpot won the Carnegie International Prize for a painting called The Marble Worker. And of course, this was an exhibition held in Pittsburgh in America, and was a very big deal for a young artist. And that same year, he went out to America and he spent several months in Chicago, and in fact had a relationship with this man, Robert Allington, who was an incredibly wealthy philanthropist in Chicago. And what you can see in this portrait is, on the one hand, an informality about portraiture. A lot of portraiture, of course, at that time in the Edwardian age, was very stuffy and very formal. And of course, what you have here is a completely neutral background. He's wearing a kind of light hat. Robert Allington had actually trained as an artist. And there's a certain amount of not just informality, but and a sense of intimacy with the sitter. And then this work was actually acquired by the Tate Gallery. And during that same trip, he painted a number of figures of society figures in America. Isabel also painted in 19 with a similar, very neutral, understated quality. And again, in her dress, very kind of, for the time, very, very modern. This is another work coming from the Tate, from that same group, of a model called Guillaume Roland, and he was a French, a young Breton. He was of Canada, which is and what you have with works like this is this move between portraiture and what might be known as kind of subject. It's not central to how we kind of read and understand the picture. It's very much a kind of study in understated color, and of course presenting the model in profile. But at the same time, he was thinking about how to bring a new energy to portraiture. And so this is one of his patrons, Angela Mond, Mrs. Emile Mond, and she's dressed to go to the Chelsea Arts Club ball in 1912, I think, when the theme was a kind of Venetian masked ball, and she's actually wearing a dress worn by the ballerina Camargo, which is a painting in the Wallace collection. And so what you've got is actually, this is both a portrait and a record of a kind of fancy dress ball, but it's also kind of suggestion of a dancer. And Philpot in the 1910s was very interested in the Russian ballet, which came, the Diaghilev's Ballet Russe, which came to London, and he saw dancers such as Nijinsky, and he made a painting of Nijinsky on the stage in the Royal Opera House. Tamar Karsavina, and he painted her in her Russian ballet costume, which we will hopefully have in the exhibition, and a number of other kind of depictions of dancers and ballerinas. And one of the others we'll have in the show is a work called The Little Dancer. But at the same time, he was also creating sensitive portraits of unknown Black models. This one we actually know his name is Billy. And in 1912 to 1913, he produced a group of works. And I think what's very interesting about these is they are pretty much the first portraits of Black models in modern British art that we know about. And previously in the 18th and 19th century, most of the times when Black people were depicted in paintings, they were as servants who were usually subsidiary to a lord or lady or whatever. And here, of course, the focus is entirely on the subject in their own right, and they're depicted with a certain nobility and grace and as individuals. So we will have a group of at least 3 depictions of Billy, and these relate to a painting which is now in the National Gallery of Ontario called The Morning Prayer. And so we'll have this drawing, a related painting, and the drawing for that painting. The earliest known portrait in 20th century Britain was a work by Harold Gilman a year earlier called The Garden in the Garden Museum. One of the pictures I'm very pleased to have found from that time, and it was last exhibited a century ago, just under a century ago in 1923. And I had this photograph, and I actually did a call out on Instagram. And although that didn't reveal the artist, I was able to track the owner who had inherited it from his father, who had inherited it from the original collector. So it hasn't been exhibited in public, and it was, of course, this wonderful, and of course we'll have it in full color in the exhibition rather than this black and white photograph. But I was particularly keen to bring together these early portraits of Black sitters because they're interest in Philpot's work right the way through to the 1930s. At the same time, during the First World War, Philpot went into the army for a couple of years, and then later on was an official war artist and did a number of portraits of admirals in the Navy. But during the war, he also depicted the war poet Siegfried Sassoon. And this rather kind of heroic picture is coming from the Fitzwilliam Museum. And this was used a lot in volumes of his poetry in that time. And of course, Siegfried Sassoon, having become this kind of key figure in terms of the war poets, spoke out against the war. And he apparently did this just after quite a kind of notorious figure. Within the exhibition, there'll be a number of these portraits of young men who were friends of Philpot, but also portraits of members of his family who also kind of served as models. And his sisters, Daisy, is in the foreground, and Gertrude, modelled for this picture. Now, it was painted in 1923, and in that year, it completed, it started in 1922, completed in 1923. And that year, he was made a Royal Academician, and he was any of the Royal Academicians at that point in time. So it was quite a significant achievement, but it was also reflective of the fact that Philpot could paint like an old master, and you can see traditional dress. He apparently made up these costumes, but using kind of his sisters and sometimes his nieces and other members of the family for these, which gives them this kind of intimacy. But these deep reds and ochres are very much kind of borrowed from Venetian old master painting. So although it's painted in the 20s, it's very much looking back to an older tradition of art. A few years later, he paints work which is now in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, and there's kind of these interesting kind of pairings of kind of family members. This is a much more modern picture in a way, and was painted at his country house, Baynard's Manor, and gives this sense of awkwardness of these kind of two girls with their hair cut short, which of course in the 20s was a very modern thing to do. They could almost be kind of figures from today. And another work from the same year, we don't yet know whether this one is definitely coming, but when it was exhibited at the Royal Academy, it caused a kind of, it was a kind of huge talking point and success, because it showed a figure from society who a few years later became Lady Melchett, seated on the ground. And so of course, normally with formal portraiture, they would be on a seat or standing or whatever. And here, of course, she's got her bobbed haircut. She's just on a pile of cushions on the floor. And actually what he was looking at was some of the depictions of Russian ballerinas and things like this. So bringing this kind of new sense of informal, elegant portraiture. At the same time, he was also doing what are known as subject pictures. Pictures where we don't necessarily know who the sitters are. So they're not portraits, but they're exploring an atmosphere or a theme, perhaps from classical mythology, perhaps from literature. And in the early 20s, he went to North Africa, he went to Morocco, he went to Tunisia. In 1923, he actually painted the first official portrait of King Fuad of Egypt. So he traveled out to Egypt for a number of months, and he went to meet Howard Carter, who showed him the newly opened tomb of Tutankhamun. So he had this kind of interest in North African and Arabic cultures. And this work here, L'après-midi tunisien, is interesting in that because of this relationship between the men, and of course it plays on 19th century artistic genre known as Orientalism, these kind of imaginary Oriental interiors or settings with kind of languid reclining figures. And of course, we don't know what the dynamic is between these two men. One is holding a flower, the other has a flower behind his ear. But the suggestion is, of course, of some kind of flirtation. In fact, in the preparatory drawings, which we're hoping to borrow from the Courtauld, you can actually see that their poses change, and they don't touch in the final painting, but they do in the preparatory drawings. And Philpot was a gay man in a period where, of course, in a way, but what you find in some of these works from the 20s and 30s is this attempt to express some of this possibility of kind of desire, I guess, between men in his work. And this is one of the studies in the Courtauld Institute. One of the sections of the exhibition will look at the theme of myth and legend, Greek myth, Roman myth, and how it inspired him and his work throughout his career. And at the outbreak of the First World War, Philpot and to get back on the refugee world. But it depicts a kind of broken classical statue of some kind of goddess at the base of the floor, the base of the seabed. It was rather kind of prescient, given that the war broke out, these kind of civilizations, fallen civilizations, the war broke out just when he was working on it. But within the exhibition will be a number of his sculptures, because he also produced sculptures in wax, which would be cast in plaster and terracotta. And some of these, of course, looking back to classical antiquity and classical sculpture. And there's a famous sculpture in the Uffizi of Restless in 1905, 1906. He would have seen the work of Auguste Rodin, and he later owned a Rodin bronze, and of course Rodin's kiss with this kind of couple intertwining is a possible point of reference for this, and of course wrestlers, but also potentially a kind of a clinch of some kind. He was looking at classical statuary and the figures of artists such as Michelangelo doing murals in places like the Sistine Chapel, but also sculpting in stone from the block. And there's very much this kind of this muscular kind of classicism in these works. We're borrowing this work from Brighton Art Gallery, and it's called Journey of the Spirit. And he did a number of these works in around 1920, 21, these kind of epic figures in these kind of rather kind of barren wildernesses. But one of the other kind of subject paintings he did at this time was reflecting his interest in performance and almost an extension of his depiction of kind of ballet dancers and others, acrobats waiting to rehearse. And this shows a group of 4 acrobats kind of looking absolutely exhausted. And it's interesting that this work is almost entirely contemporary to a lot of the Germans, the Neue Sachlichkeit or new objectivity artists working in Germany in the 20s and 30s. So artists like George Gross, Otto Dix, and others in it. And this extreme realism where these are not heroic figures. They are, he's showing their exhaustion. But of course, there's also, for Philpot, a kind of interest in the male form that kind of comes through in these works. We won't have this, but just as a little point of reference, Philpot painted the ceiling in the royal bedroom in Queen Mary's Doll's House, which was the inspiration for the 1934 Model Art Gallery. So there's a nice kind of connection point to other elements of our program. And in the 20s, religious things, and Philpot was a very committed Christian, and in fact he became the president of the Guild of Catholic Painters. So and one of the works that he depicted was the Angel of the Annunciation. So when Mary finds out that she's pregnant, of course, and an angel comes to tell her that she's pregnant with Jesus. What we see here is the scene from the perspective of the Virgin Mary. We don't see the Virgin Mary, but we see the approach of the angel, who's obviously arriving into a modern porch with the brick-laid porch. So it's an extraordinary, he's kind of taking a biblical scene and reimagining it. If it were to happen today, what would it be like to see this kind of angel arriving and kind of holding a kind of form of lilies? But on the other hand, the treatment of the drapery is also very much like a kind of pre-Raphaelite painting, or indeed an Italian Renaissance painting. And this, he did a number of depictions with this kind of red-haired figure, who's a kind of an imaginary figure based on his model George Bridgman. This is another painting, unfortunately, image of the risen resurrection, the kind of discovery of Christ in the tomb. And he's looking at the Renaissance paintings of artists such as Piero della Francesca, and unfortunately cropped in the foreground, but the kind of sleeping soldier at the base of the tomb. But quite a kind of eerie picture in many ways, but reflective of his Catholic faith at that point in time. And then also works such as this, and Balthazar, who is one of the 3 kings who comes to visit Christ in the story of his birth in the New Testament. And this depicts Philpot's Jamaican model, Henry Thomas. And he had started to work for Philpot in 1929. He was a stoker found wandering in the gallery by Philpot's kind of friend and apparently his godson, Oliver Messel, the theatre designer. And Henry was to sit for Philpot over really the next 9 years, and right the way through to his death in 1937. And he also worked for Philpot in a kind of domestic sense, as a kind of housekeeper at some points in time. And in my research for the exhibition, I found a lot of kind of details of his sitting records and so on. We know that he was born in Jamaica in about 1900, and he went first of all as a stowaway to New York, and then came to Britain. And the Bible story. This is a photograph of him, which gives you a sense of him in the 1920s. This is a work which currently has the title Negro Walking, but one of the things that we're doing as part of the exhibition is seeking to retitle some of these original titles from the 1920s and 30s. And so this, I've found, was actually also titled Jamaican Walking, which is much more specific when it's exhibited at the Royal Academy. And so I think we will not be exhibiting it with this work. It might be a man walking or whatever. Again, you can see that he's been looking at classical statuary and also Rodin, and this, excuse me, shows Henry Thomas striding forward, but it also has these kinds of figures that we have in 19 for an interior of Mulberry House, which was a building which was designed originally by Edwin Lutyens, and his patrons, Henry and Gwen Mond, and we've seen one of the portraits of Gwen Mond previously, commissioned this interior. And he did a whole series of murals based on the loves of Jupiter, and Jupiter, who came to Leda as a swan and made love with her, came as a shower of golden coins, and also was involved in some way with Echo. These murals in 1930 really kind of signified a change in style. Philpot that year had been out to America and traveled to New York with Matisse, Henri Matisse, on the Mauritania to judge the Carnegie Institute Prize, and saw, of course, skyscrapers going up in New York and this kind of emergence of the Art Deco style. And we'll have this series of, the murals no longer exist, but we'll have a series of kind of the studies for them. And this is Echo and Narcissus. This is a drawing for them in the Courtauld Institute. And this is a statue of Echo and Narcissus, very much kind of classical in theme. And of course, Narcissus in the classical myth falls in love with his own reflection, and so kind of turns his back on the nymph Echo. And originally this would have been displayed on a mirror, so you would have this sense of how he was looking into his own reflection. In the 1930s, Philpot made a number of works exploring Greek and Roman myth. This is Venus and Cupid, and actually the figure of Venus was apparently modeled by Henry Thomas, his Jamaican model. and the young figure by new works were exhibited in 1932. Papers declared Philpot goes Picasso, and you can see Picasso's works from the 20s and 30s. Because he was known as such a traditional painter, it caused newspaper headings, and was almost a kind of scandal in the way that he would change his style. This is Philpot in America with Henri Matisse and the other judges for the Carnegie Institute Prize. And it's often thought that actually kind of coming into close proximity with Matisse like this, and being part of this kind of judging process, the first prize was actually won by this work by Pablo Picasso. It's very much kind of classical Picasso painting. And it's often thought that this led to his change in style. He moved to Paris in 1931, and he took a completely modern studio on the Boulevard Raspail, and actually it was one of the, I think it was the studio on the left-hand side or the one above it. And this was designed by an architect called Bruno L. Hucken. And he literally just moved, and he filled with modernist. It formed the background for a series of new modern pictures. This is a work called Angel Ascending. You can actually see the window frame of that picture, and in a way it's kind of morphing this kind of religious art and the kind of classical with modernity with his paintings. He's no longer building up glazes, but using much more linear approach and kind of stippled brush work. This is another work called 101st Afternoon with Penelope, and this is Greek myth, and Penelope was for many years the shroud which every night she would unpick, because when it was complete, she would have to marry one of her many suitors. And so, but what we see is them sitting in this 30s modernist apartment. So Philpot has updated the Greek myth to the 1930s. In 1931, in October 1931, he went to Berlin. The cult might associate with and Karl-Heinz Müller, who we see here. We know from the writer of Cabaret, Christopher Isherwood, we know from his diaries that he also knew this same person. And Karl-Heinz Müller appears in a number of works by Philpot immediately after this trip to Berlin. And this is a depiction of him. It's the window frame in the story of St. Sebastian. He's martyred for his Christian faith. So on the one hand, this is a Christian image, but it's also a subject which a lot of good gay artists across the centuries really have depicted. And so it was something that would have been recognized as, coded reference. And we know that it's Karl-Heinz because he's missing two fingers, which Karl-Heinz also had missing. And these, for example, an El Greco and a painting by Sodoma of St. Sebastian, often very kind of homoerotic in tone. And in Berlin, we think that he saw the work of Otto Dix, the kind of German new objectivity artist with his kind of nightclub scenes. This is one of Philpot's own scenes, Lokal, depicting a kind of Berlin nightclub with these fighting figures in the background, musicians, kind of drinking ladies in the foreground, a very kind of unromanticized view of the kind of seedy underworld of Berlin that he experienced. But he also, whilst in Paris, did this interesting series of kind of cabaret clubs and performers. And this is a work from 1931, Entrance to the Tegarde. And the Tegarde Beguine was a nightclub literally about 5 minutes walk from where Philpot was in Montparnasse. And we know that the doorman for this picture was a man, a French Caribbean man called Felix. And in fact, I found some of the drawings of Felix, which we hope to include in the exhibition, but it really kind of captures that kind of cabaret scene in Paris of the 1930s. And you kind of can see how that imagery kind of influenced the design for musicals such as Cabaret. And of course, it's the same time that Edward Burrough was doing his work. Such as Minuit Chanson. And this is his painting of a Martinican, so French Caribbean cabaret performer known as Tom Whiskey. His actual name was Julien Zaire, and in fact, I found his records in the National Archives of Martinique, so we know he was kind of a real person. But again, he's depicted here in black tie in Philpot's apartment with the kind of chromium furniture behind. And images such as this, and this is another work of him with the gramophone behind, are very much kind of Art Deco 30s chic, but showing these figures as kind of cultured figures rather than other images from the time, which often kind of depicted Black people as social outsiders. And at that point in time in the 1920s and 30s, there was a movement in Harlem in New York known as the Harlem Renaissance, and artists such as Winold Rice created portraits which were very much part of that. And when Philpot was in New York in 1930, we know that he went to Harlem. And in fact, Philpot did a portrait of the same figure depicted here, Ronald Hayes. He was an African-American tenor, and he depicted him in the 1920s, although unfortunately that painting is currently lost. This is another Winold Rice, and there's a typo with the label there, but it gives you a sense of other works by other artists at that time. This is a portrait of Felix, who is the model that we saw as the doorman at the entrance to the Tegarde. And there's a number of portraits of Felix that he did in 1931-32. And here very much depicted in profile with a hibiscus flower. I think it's a kind of homage to Paul Gauguin. There's a painting by Paul Gauguin of a model with a flower behind his ear. But his sense of colour with work such as this has really kind of come to the fore. He produced a number of very kind of glamorous portraits during the 1930s, and with kind of broken brushstrokes, and he's playing with tone with these works. They're often very muted in color schemes, and so this is his friend Gwendolyn Cleaver. This is his portrait of his sister Gertrude, called here Mrs. Clement Cross. And we know, for example, that the zebra cushion appears in a number of pictures and was obviously a kind of decorative motif. But she's very much depicted as this kind of 1930 with her kind of fringe. This kind of models for life drawing. And this is a portrait of his close friend with whom he had a relationship at one point, Vivian Forbes, who was also an artist depicted here holding portfolio in front of an easel, so depicted as an artist here. And then finally, this group of paintings of Henry Thomas, and this, of course, is the work from Pallant House Gallery, where Henry is depicted in profile. And I think one of the things about, I mean, Henry was almost a kind of muse of sorts to Philpot, particularly in the 30s. And I'm leaping forward to some of the still lifes. I've slightly got the slides in the wrong ways, but I'll come back to that. So in the 30s, he also produced a number of still life paintings, and which was a kind of new theme of his work. And in a way, it's largely because his change in style meant that his traditional clientele for portraiture, the kind of lords and ladies and figures from high society, were largely quite traditional in their tastes and didn't necessarily, apart from a few of them, the change in style to a much more modern aesthetic was quite challenging. And so actually he started to paint different kinds of subjects. So still life, this is of lilacs, statues and leaves. And what's clear, of course, is that these are exquisitely rendered as still life paintings. And the room 17, we will have a room of his still life paintings from the 1930s, together with some of his travel images from Morocco and France and Belgium. To go back to Henry Thomas, this is Philpot at Philpot's, I think it's Wales domestic shores for him. But he also modelled, and this is one of the works from the last of Philpot's kind of life. He died in 1937, so this was earlier in 1937. And of course, its subject matter recalls the painting of Ingres of the Valpinçon bather, these kind of Orientalist paintings of bathers, and also Man Ray's violin de Ingres, this kind of back view. You can see here, that's the Ingres Valpinçon bather. You get a sense of the motif that he's thinking about, and Man Ray as well from the 20s. But it's interesting how in some ways in the 30s, Philpot kind of almost defined himself in relation to Henry in some of the kind of public photographs. And we'll have this photograph within the exhibition. And here Henry is kind of standing holding an easel in the background. And we can see here him modelling in a tropical setting, which we may or may not have from the Courtauld. And this is one of the other works that he did in the mid-30s. And Ava Lutyens was a fashion designer. She's actually the daughter-in-law of the architect Edwin Lutyens, who Philpot also, of course, did work for. But again, this kind of sense of 30s chic. And I think what's interesting is that even though his style or technique of painting changed, he was still, his ability to kind of capture luscious and luxurious kind of textiles, whether that's kind of sheen on velvet or whatever, is still very much there. And then other works that he created in the 30s continue to develop those themes around performance. And I showed you before that the circus performers in the 30s, he revisited that, excuse me, with this work, Acrobats Waiting to Rehearse. And apparently this was based on two boxers that were brought by a friend to visit, and they kind of sat there looking quite combative. I mean, this one thing you note with a lot of the pictures of Philpot is, of course, actually often they don't look directly out at you. This is a kind of rare example of this kind of direct kind of connection between the subjects and you, the viewer. And we're going to be borrowing this work from Brighton Museums and Art Gallery. And then also this work of Glyn by, I'm sure, in the role of Laertes in Hamlet. This is a press photograph from when it was in the Queer British Art Show at Tate Britain. I mean, the ultimate in camp, so to speak. I mean, there's a lot of that interest in performance in theatre and ballet kind of carries through the exhibition, and sometimes in straightforward depictions of ballet dancers or performers, and sometimes as characters in role, but actually sometimes also in terms of portraiture. Apologies, my slide is slightly, I was doing in the wrong order. This is Philpot with Henry Thomas, which is a staged photograph that should be with the other one before. And this is the study the acrobats waiting to rehearse. And throughout the 1930s, Philpot spent a lot of time in France. First of all, of course, in Paris, but also going down to Cannes and Havre. Probably on one of his trips, he would have travelled through Le Havre on the Normandy coast. And very much, there are similarities here with the work of Jean Cocteau and also Edward Burrough from around about the same time. We've seen that already. And there's Jean Cocteau Sailor, and this is an Edward Burrough bar scene also from around about the same time. And then finally, we'll finish with these of portraits of Henry Thomas. And again, the title of this one, I should say, I think it will be Melancholy Man. So we're not using that title, even though it was at the time part of a cultural movement. I think into the wider society, it's a problematic term to use. And again, here, this work will be called Harlequin. And this work needs that kind of racial identifier in the title. And this is almost the final work in the exhibition. It's very kind of sensitive and on Henry. And there's something very moving about this work, I think, where his eyes almost seem to be filled with sadness. So I will leave it there. And I guess Holly might have some questions for me.
One of the questions I was wondering about is the relationship between mythical, and there was lots of Greek mythology coming in, and then you also have his Christian upbringing, or did he turn Christian? Or?
So in terms of the relationship between mythology and Christianity, it's a very good question. The years of the 20th century, and in about 1905, converted to Catholicism. And at the same time, throughout his career, he's doing his depictions of classical myth, the legend. And also in the 20s, doing paintings of Christian subjects. And of course, you could say somebody who is a devout Christian, why is he doing that? Because actually, of course, does he necessarily believe in these predecessors, these kind of pagan gods and goddesses? I mean, my view is that he is using these myths and legends as a way of creating subject pictures to explore a form of narrative, and sometimes often it's a way of expressing something about his own desires, his own relationships that he couldn't openly in the 1920s and 30s discuss. So something like Oedipus, for example, unfortunately we won't have that work in the exhibition, but there's a work now in the National Gallery of Victoria in Australia, which is all 1930s from this picture, and known that Philpot was possibly saying something about sexuality. And I think that's one of the tensions at the heart of Philpot's work, in that his expression of a sense of identity as a gay man and his sense of religion are both very, very strong. And you would say that they're kind of in opposition, but somehow he kind of managed to navigate that in his work. And I guess also in the kinds of places where he was exhibiting, such as the Royal Academy, in the 19th century, there was a whole tradition of history painting with these kinds of themes being shown by, all kinds of pre-Raphaelites and things like this. Of course, what Philpot did was he kind of made them more modern. And so sometimes in modern dress, sometimes in elements such as in the painting of the Angel of the Annunciation, where you can see it's a modern porch. Mm-hmm. So he kind of he's not depicting an angel appearing into a stable or something like that. So it's he kind of plays around with these kind of elements of performance, really.
And the other thing is, you said about how it used to have a mirror under the Narcissus and Echo. I was wondering if that was something you were thinking about doing.
Yes. It kind of depends on which. There's plasters of that statue. There were 2 plasters made during his life, and there were a number of bronzes which were cast subsequently. It would be good to recreate that original presentation, if possible, to give a sense of how that would have worked as a statue. So it's definitely something. The problem, of course, is if it was cast in the 1980s, those figures are bolted into a marble base. So unless we could create something that would sit around them, it might be a bit more challenging, but it's okay. I guess in terms of creative activities, there's a number of themes to explore in terms of portraiture and identity, in terms of still life, and I actually haven't shown many works here, but I can circulate some of those, because there's a whole room which I think people will, as modern still lifes, they're very, very beautiful paintings. I think in terms of dance and performance, from the ballet dancers to the actors, and almost kind of flamboyant portraiture, which is an extension of that, and how that goes into things like the acrobats, circus as an extension of performance and dance, and cabaret as well. So there are these very kind of particular themes, and of course then religion as well, and within the kind of and then of course the other one, of course, is the presentation of black sitters, a kind of sensitive portrayal of black sitters in the 30s, because I think that's something which Philpot was very unusual at that time, in building up really such a good body of work, and I think also how it moves with his change of style as well. And one of the things I've been trying to do is to find as much as I can about the sitters, where possible, so that we have their names and the titles and things like that. Because if we're able to, you can't always find that out. In 1910, for example, but story as well. And so I think that's something within the labels, is also kind of identifying who the models are, if I know that. So yes.
Awesome.
Good.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure.